Hi, my name is Jocelyn Neal, and this is a workshop about doubling guidelines for part writing. I recommend you have some staff paper available so that you can take notes and do some of the chord voicing exercises along with me. And here is our agenda. We're going to start by discussing what is chord doubling, why are there so many spurious rules about it, what notes can't you double, what notes can you double, when can you omit a chord tone, and why you should spend more time thinking linearly rather than vertically. Okay, here are the basics. In a chord voicing, when you have two instances of one chord tone, we call that note doubled. Now, if you have a triad, there are three different chord members, the root, the third, and the fifth. And if you're doing standard four-voice part writing, you have four voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Since you only have three chord tones and you have four voices, some chord tone has to appear twice. And there are lots of so-called rules that people like to talk about. These come from some older textbooks that used to provide guidelines to help students learn the basics of chord voicings. Some teachers treat these guidelines as rules, even though these guidelines actually create problems in certain circumstances. So here are some of the things you might hear people say. They might say always double the root of a root position triad. They might say always double the soprano of a first inversion triad. And they will often say never double the chordal third. None of these are rules, and all of these will cause lots of problems if you try to apply them universally in your part writing. So here is a better approach. We want to think linearly. We want to think about lines and motion in our voices. We want to focus on the independence of our four voices. And here's the one guideline that we do need to adhere to. Don't double tendency tones. And a tendency tone is a note that has to move to a particular note next. Why? Because if you have two instances of a tendency tone, both of those notes would have to move to the same next note, which would create parallel octaves, or the implied same next note, or else one of them wouldn't be able to fulfill its intended point of resolution. So the only guideline we need to adhere to is don't double tendency tones. Let's talk a little bit more about what a tendency tone is. A tendency tone is a leading tone. A tendency tone is a chordal seventh, and a tendency tone is a note that is part of a fixed voice leading pattern, and we're going to find those in cadential 6/4 chords and in passing 6/4 chords. The only guideline that we have to really remember is don't double tendency tones. So let's go over what can I double. You can double any chord tone, the root, the third, or the fifth, that is not a tendency tone. Wait, really? Is it okay to double the third of a chord? Yes, as long as it's not the leading tone. Now let's look at some examples of that in a part writing situation. We're in the key of F major, and we're going to start with a 1 chord, and let's go ahead and do some part writing. I'm going to voice that first chord with scale degree 3 in the soprano using a close spacing. Moving into my 1/6 chord, I'm going to choose to use some parallel tenths motion, taking the soprano up to C. I'll keep my alto and my tenor on common tones. Moving into my 3rd chord, I have a predominant harmony. This is a 2/6 chord. It's going to be a G minor triad in first inversion. I'm going to use contrary motion and bring the soprano down to the note B flat. I'll bring my alto up to G, and I'll place my tenor on the note D. I'm then going to collapse that harmony inward as I move into my dominant function chord, which is this 5 chord. Our soprano down to the note G, that's scale degree 2. I'll let my alto sink to the leading tone, and I will place my tenor on the same note as the bass. Now let's look at the doublings that resulted from this part writing. In my first chord, I had a doubled root, that's the note F. In my second chord, I had a doubled chordal fifth. In my 3rd chord, I had a doubled chordal third, and that is a good voicing. I'm using good part writing, moving into that harmony. Moving into my 4th chord, I had a doubled root of the chord. So in the first 3 chords of this progression, I have doubled a different chord tone in each instance. Now let's talk for a moment about the voicings of the dominant triad. I'm still in the key of F major here. If I try to voice this chord, I'm dealing with a triad that has scale degrees 5, 7, and 2 in it. Scale degree 7 in this dominant function chord is behaving as a leading tone, and therefore I cannot double it. I have lots of options. I can double the root of this chord. Here I have 2 Cs. I could alternately double the 5th of this chord. Here I have 2 Gs. but I cannot double the third of this particular chord because the third of this chord is the leading tone, and I cannot double that leading tone. Sometimes when we are part writing, we're going to omit a chord tone from a particular voicing. So let's talk about when we can omit a chord tone. You can omit the chordal fifth in a root position triad or a root position seventh chord. And the key idea there is it has to be in root position. If you omit the fifth in a triad, you typically triple the root. So you have a voicing that will have 3 roots and 1/3 of the chord. If you omit the chordal fifth in a seventh chord, then you typically double the root of the chord. And there are certain voice leading instances where omitting a chord tone is necessary to create good linear part writing. Here I'm in the key of B flat major, and I have a simple tonic chord. I can voice this chord with 3 B flats and 1 D, and that's a perfectly acceptable voicing of that chord where I have omitted the chordal fifth. In the same key, still in the key of B flat major, I could voice a dominant seventh chord, my 5/7 chord here in root position, and I could voice that chord to omit the chordal fifth. So in this particular instance, I'm going to have 1/3 of the chord, 1/7 of the chord, and I'm going to double the root of the chord. And that would be a perfectly acceptable voicing for a dominant seventh chord in root position. Now, there are 5 special cases of doubling that I'd like to go over that are really important to practice. The first of these is in deceptive cadences. All your upper voices, your soprano, alto, and tenor, should go to scale degrees 1 and 3 in a deceptive cadence, and that typically will result in a doubled chordal third, which is scale degree 1. The second case, when you have motion from a dominant seventh chord to tonic, when the leading tone is in the soprano, you are often going to need to omit the fifth from the 5/7 chord. The third special case, if you have motion from a 5/7 chord to a tonic chord with the leading tone in the soprano, your other situation is you might need to omit the fifth from the tonic chord and triple the root in that instance. Your fourth special case is in a cadential 6/4 chord. Always double the bass because the fourth above the bass and the sixth above the bass are both behaving as tendency tones. And your final special case is that if you have a passing 6/4 chord, double the bass. Let's take a look at all of those. Here we are in the key of D minor, and we're going to look at a deceptive cadence. This is a progression from the dominant triad going into the major triad built on lowered scale degree 6. The first chord that I have voiced here is a 2 half diminished 6/5. Moving into that dominant triad, I'm going to keep scale degree 2 in the soprano. I'm going to catch my raised leading tone in the alto, and I'm going to place scale degree 5 in the tenor. Resolving into my 6th chord, this is going to be a B flat major triad. The soprano is going to come down to scale degree 1. The alto's leading tone is going to go up to scale degree 1. And my tenor is going to move down to scale degree 3, which is the 5th of the chord. You'll notice that this is the correct voicing of a deceptive cadence, and it has resulted in a doubled third of the chord, which is scale degree 1. Let's look at another instance of a deceptive cadence. Here we are in the key of F major, and once again, we are going to part write a deceptive cadence, which is the dominant 7th chord, in this case, moving to a minor triad built on scale degree 6. I'm in the key of F major, and I start with this 2/6 chord that we have voiced here as a G minor triad. We're going to move into a dominant 7th chord. That dominant 7th chord is going to keep the common tone tenor to become the chordal 7th. I'm going to lift my alto to the leading tone on E. I'm going to keep my soprano on G. There's my dominant 7th chord. I'm now going to move into a D minor triad. The chordal 7th is going to move down, resolving correctly. The leading tone is going to go up, and scale degree 1 in the soprano as well is going to complete that melodic motion. Here's the correct voicing for that deceptive cadence, and you'll notice that again, I have doubled the third of the chord, which is the note F in this context, which is scale degree 1. Now let's talk about cadences where we have a dominant 7th chord moving to tonic. And in many voice leading situations, we're going to have an incomplete chord either on the 5/7 chord or on the final tonic triad. Here's an example in the key of E minor. We're going to start with a 2 diminished 6 chord. This is an F sharp diminished triad in first inversion, and I'm going to move from that into a dominant 7th chord. I'm going to bring the soprano down to the raised leading tone. I'm going to keep my tenor on the common tone A, which is going to become the chordal 7th of that dominant 7th chord, and I'm going to let my alto move down to double the root of this chord. You'll notice I do not have a 5th of this chord. I'm dealing with a root position 5/7 chord, and I have omitted the pitch F sharp from the chord. What this is going to allow is a nice part writing motion into my final tonic triad. So let's now resolve this 5/7 chord into one. My chordal 7th in the tenor is going to come down to the pitch G. My leading tone in the soprano has to go up to E, and I can keep my tenor on the B, creating a complete final triad. You'll notice that I had no 5th in my dominant 7th chord, and that's absolutely fine. That's a good place to omit the chordal 5th. First inversion, and let's move from that into a dominant 7th chord. I'm going to bring my soprano down to the raised leading tone. I'm going to allow my tenor to go down to scale degree 2, which is the chordal 5th, and I'm going to let my alto pick up the chordal 7th, which is the note A. When I resolve that into my final tonic triad, the chordal 7th must go down. That's going to come down to scale degree 3. I'm going to bring my leading tone in the soprano up to scale degree 1. And that's going to leave me with the tenor doubling the root of that chord with the bass. I now have a correct final chord voicing. It has 3 roots and 1/3, and you'll notice that I have omitted the 5th from this chord. When you have a complete dominant 7th chord with the leading tone in the soprano, it's going to resolve into an incomplete tonic triad. So this is another instance where it is not only acceptable, but necessary to omit the chordal 5th from that last root position triad. For our final 2 special cases, let's take a look first at a cadential 6/4 chord. Now, there are 2 ways to provide the harmonic analysis for a cadential 6/4 chord. Either is acceptable, so whichever method of labeling a cadential 6/4 chord you are used to, that's totally fine. Some teachers label a cadential 6/4 chord as a 1/6/4 chord, which acknowledges its pitch content. That is correct. Some teachers label a cadential 6/4 chord as a dominant function chord with voice leading. That is also a correct way of labeling it. However you choose to label it, we're going to be part writing a cadential 6/4 chord on the downbeat of this measure. We're in the key of G major, and the doubling rule for a cadential 6/4 chord is that we always double the bass of the chord. So that bass is going to be scale degree 5. Here, that's going to be the pitch D. And so we're going to have the alto, in this case, double the bass. Both of those voices are going to be on scale degree 5. Another voice is going to be a 4th above the bass. I'm going to choose to put that in the tenor. There's my note G, a 4th above the bass. And my last voice is going to be a 6th above the bass. In this case, that's going to be the note B, and I'll put it in the soprano. The voice leading out of my cadential 6/4 chord brings the 6th above the bass down to a 5th above the bass. That was the interval of a 6th, and now that is moving down to become the interval of a 5th. The voice leading for a cadential 6/4 chord takes the note that is a 4th above the bass and brings it down to a 3rd above the bass. So the interval that was a 4th is now going to be a 3rd above the bass. And in this case, my 4th voice is going to maintain its pitch, keeping a common tone D. We'll go ahead and resolve this chord. In this case, I'm going to bring my soprano down to G. I'll take my alto down to B, and I will allow my tenor, which was on the leading tone in an inner voice, to jump down to the chordal 5th. And that is the correct part writing and doubling for a cadential 6/4 chord. Finally, our last special case is a passing 6/4 chord. Here I have a passing 6/4 chord as a 5/6/4, moving between a root position tonic triad and a first inversion tonic triad. We're in the key of G major, and this particular chord, a passing 6/4 chord, is often used in a voice exchange setting. So where my bass is walking up G, A, B, I'm going to allow my soprano to walk down B, A, G, and that is the contrapuntal reason why this chord is voiced with a doubled bass. Again, it's the bass note, which is technically the chordal 5th, that is being doubled here. So in this particular case, I have both the soprano and the bass on the pitch A, and I also need for this chord a D, which we will keep as a common tone in the alto, and an F sharp, which I will put in the tenor. Let's go ahead and resolve this chord. I'm going to move into a 1/6 chord. I'm going to keep my common tone D in the alto and bring my tenor back up to G. And you'll notice that in my passing 6/4 chord, the bass is doubled. That's the correct doubling for a passing 6/4 chord. So here are your notes to remember. Think linearly, not vertically. When we're part writing, we're thinking about a soprano melody, an alto melody, a tenor melody, and a bass melody. And we want to be moving through our part writing with our attention on the linear motion. Focus on the independence of the voices. Don't double tendency tones, and those are any note that has to move to a particular next note. And always keep linear motion at the heart of your part writing to create good part writing. That is a summary of your doubling guidelines for part writing. Thanks for watching.